He stood at the altar, preaching about truth, about discipline, about resisting temptation, about living a life that God could see, even in secret. His voice was steady, controlled, convincing. The kind of voice people trusted without question. Because to them, he wasn't just a pastor. He was the example. The man who had it all together. The man who seemed untouched by the struggles he warned others about. Week after week, the church filled up to hear him speak. Families sat in the front rows. Couples listened closely to his words on marriage. Women came to him for guidance, for prayer, for answers. And he gave them exactly what they were looking for: calm reassurance, spiritual direction, a sense that someone understood them. Inside that church, his presence felt unshakable, his reputation untouchable. He knew people's secrets, their fears, their weaknesses, their private battles no one else ever saw. And they believed those secrets were safe with him, because that's what a pastor does. A single thought that refuses to go away. And in this church, that feeling had already begun to spread, quietly, carefully, from one person to another. Because while the congregation saw a man of God, others were starting to see something else, something they couldn't explain yet, something they weren't ready to say out loud, but something that was about to change everything.
At first, it didn't look like a scandal. It looked like coincidence. Small details, easy to dismiss. A conversation overheard in passing. A look that lasted just a second too long. A pattern no one could fully explain. But patterns don't need to be obvious to be real. They just need time. And in this church, time was quietly connecting everything. It started with one woman. She didn't go public. She didn't accuse anyone. But something about her story didn't sit right. Late counseling sessions, private meetings that extended beyond what anyone considered normal, a level of attention that felt different, personal. At first, she convinced herself it meant nothing, that it was guidance, that it was spiritual care, until the boundaries began to blur. And once they blurred, they didn't come back. She kept it to herself.
If you want to uncover more chilling true crime stories and see justice exposed, subscribe to Crime Vaults as we bring light to the darkest true crime cases and never miss the secrets hidden in plain sight.
Because speaking up would mean questioning the one man everyone trusted. And in a place built on faith, that kind of doubt comes with consequences. So she stayed silent, until she realized she wasn't the only one. Another woman had a similar story, then another, each one hesitant, each one unsure, each one carrying a version of the same uncomfortable truth. Different moments, but the same pattern: private access, emotional dependency, lines that should never have been crossed, slowly disappearing. Still, no one wanted to say it out loud, because saying it out loud would make it real. And once it became real, everything would change. But silence doesn't erase truth. It only delays it. And the longer it stayed buried, the more impossible it became to ignore. Because what once felt like isolated experiences was starting to look like something much bigger, something deliberate, something repeated. And somewhere between the whispers and the doubt, one question began to take shape. How many others were there? No one had the answer yet, but they were getting closer. And the closer they got, the harder it became to pretend nothing was wrong. By the time the third story surfaced, it was no longer a coincidence. It was a pattern. And patterns don't lie. What began as quiet whispers was turning into something structured, something repeated. Each account followed the same path. It always started with trust, a moment of vulnerability, a private struggle, a need for guidance that only he seemed to understand. And he was always there, listening longer than anyone else would, speaking softer than anyone else could, creating a space that felt safe.
But safety can be an illusion, because slowly, almost invisibly, the dynamic would shift. Conversations became more personal, boundaries became less defined, and what once felt spiritual became something else entirely.
Something no one had planned for, something no one felt prepared to stop. And when it ended, it didn't end cleanly. It ended in silence, in confusion, in consequences that couldn't be explained publicly, because each woman carried something that tied them back to him, a secret that couldn't be shared, a truth that couldn't be proven, at least, not yet. For a long time, they believed they were alone, that what happened to them was isolated, that no one else would understand. Until the stories began to overlap, details aligning in ways that were impossible to ignore. The same timing, the same approach, the same careful control over when and how things happened. And then came the detail that changed everything. One of the children was not just connected to a member of the church, but to someone inside the leadership, the assistant pastor's family. That was the moment the silence started to break, because this wasn't just personal anymore. It was institutional. It had reached beyond private conversations and into the very structure of the church itself. Trust wasn't just being questioned, it was collapsing. And once that connection was made, people stopped asking if something had happened and started asking how long it had been happening. Because this wasn't a single mistake. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a system, carefully hidden, carefully repeated, and protected by the very trust that allowed it to exist. By now, the truth was no longer buried. It was surfacing, piece by piece, story by story. And with every new detail, the situation became harder to contain. Because once multiple lives are connected by the same secret, it stops being a rumor. It becomes evidence. And evidence demands to be answered.
By the time the stories aligned, silence was no longer an option. Whispers had turned into statements, and statements demanded verification, because without proof, everything could still be denied. So the investigation began quietly. No announcements, no public attention, just careful steps taken behind closed doors. Authorities knew exactly what they were dealing with, not just accusations, but a pattern that needed to be tested. And the only thing that could confirm it? DNA samples were collected with precision. Names were documented. Timelines were reconstructed, matching moments that once seemed unrelated into a single, undeniable sequence. Each detail was examined.
Each connection traced, and then the results started coming in. The first test confirmed a link, a connection that should never have existed. But one result wasn't enough. They needed consistency. They needed repetition. They needed certainty. So more tests followed, and with each new result, the same truth surfaced. The same name, the same source, the same man appearing again and again across different cases, different families, different lives. What once sounded impossible was now measurable. What once felt like suspicion was now evidence. Multiple children, different mothers, all tied together by a single DNA signature. At that point, there was no room left for doubt. No explanation that could undo what had already been confirmed. No way to contain what was about to come next. Because DNA doesn't lie. It doesn't protect reputations. It doesn't bend to influence. It reveals what has always been there, waiting to be seen. And now, everything was visible. The full scale, the full pattern, the full truth. And with that truth came a decision. This wouldn't be handled quietly. This wouldn't be hidden behind closed doors, because the man at the center of it all had built his life in public, so the exposure would be just as public. By the time the final report was completed, the case was no longer forming. It was complete. All that remained was the moment it would be revealed.
That morning felt like any other. The church filled slowly, voices low, nothing out of place. He walked in calm, composed, untouched. No hesitation, no sign that anything had changed. To him, this was just another sermon. He stepped to the altar, opened his Bible, and began to speak. Words about truth, accountability, and the cost of hidden sin. The congregation listened, focused, completely unaware that outside those walls, everything was already in motion. Authorities had made their decision, not later, not in private, but now. As he continued preaching, the doors opened. At first, no one reacted. Some thought it was late arrivals, but then came the footsteps, steady, direct, impossible to ignore.
The atmosphere shifted instantly. Tension spread across the room. They moved forward without hesitation, without announcement, without explanation. And then, he stopped, mid-sentence. For the first time, he wasn't in control. Confusion moved through the congregation, eyes shifting between the altar and the officers, waiting for something to make sense. But nothing did, until the words were spoken. He was under arrest, right there, at the altar. The same place he had stood week after week building trust now became the place it collapsed. Some froze, some stood. Others shook their heads, unable to process what they were seeing. But reality didn't pause.
As the officers stepped closer, he didn't run, he didn't argue, he didn't explain. The authority he once carried was gone, replaced by silence. The handcuffs came out, cold, final, and within seconds they were locked around his wrists. Gasps filled the room as shock turned into realization. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a mistake. This was real. The man who led them, guided them, spoke to them about truth, was now being led away. As he was escorted down the same aisle he once walked with authority, no one spoke. Because in that moment, the truth didn't need words. It had already said everything.
The silence didn't end when he was taken away. It followed everyone home. What happened inside that church didn't stay there. It spread through conversations, through families, through every person who had once believed in him. Shock turned into denial. Denial turned into anger. They replayed his sermons in their minds, searching for anything that didn't match what they had just witnessed. Others began connecting the pieces, the whispers, the rumors, the moments that once felt small but now carried weight. Families argued. Trust broke. Communities divided.
Because this wasn't just about one man anymore. It was about everything he represented. For the women involved, silence was no longer an option. What had once been hidden behind fear was now exposed by truth. And for the first time, they were no longer alone. But exposure doesn't erase damage. It doesn't undo years of control, confusion, and secrecy. It only brings it into the light, and in that light, everything looks different. The church itself began to fracture. Attendance dropped, leadership was questioned. Every message, every teaching, every moment from the past was now seen through a different lens. Because once trust is broken at that level, nothing feels the same again. But even with the arrest, even with the evidence, even with the truth laid out in front of everyone, questions remained.
How long had this been happening? How many people knew and chose to stay silent? And how does someone stand in front of a congregation, speak about truth, and live a lie this deep without being seen? Because in the end, this wasn't just about actions, it was about power. The kind of power built on trust. The kind that allows one person to move without being questioned until it's too late. And when that power is finally exposed, the damage doesn't disappear. It lingers, in memories, in doubt, in the space where faith once felt certain. Some secrets stay hidden for years, not because they're impossible to find, but because no one wants to believe they exist, until one moment changes everything. And when it does, the truth doesn't just come out, it leaves consequences behind that no one can ignore.
In the days that followed, the story didn't fade. It grew. What happened at that altar became more than a moment. It became a turning point. Reports began to surface. Names once protected by silence started to appear in the open. The investigation expanded, moving beyond what anyone in that church had imagined. Because when one truth is exposed, it often leads to others, and this case was no different. More questions were asked, more connections uncovered, more lives pulled into something they never expected to be part of. For those who once sat in that congregation, the memory didn't leave. It replayed.
The moment the doors opened, the moment the voice stopped, the moment everything they believed shifted in seconds. Some stopped going to church entirely. Others searched for answers somewhere else. But for many, the damage wasn't just spiritual, it was personal. Because trust like that isn't easily rebuilt. It doesn't return with time. It changes shape or disappears completely. For the victims, the attention brought something they had never had before: validation. What was once dismissed as doubt was now confirmed as truth. But even that came with weight, because being heard doesn't erase what was done. It only confirms that it happened, and for some, that reality is harder to carry than silence ever was. As the legal process moved forward, the public watched closely.
Not just for an outcome, but for understanding. For something that could explain how a man could live two lives so convincingly, one in the light and one completely hidden. But not every question finds an answer. Not every detail becomes clear. Some things remain uncertain, even when the truth is exposed. Because cases like this aren't just about what happened. They're about how it was allowed to happen. For years, no one saw it. Or maybe they did, and chose not to look closer. And that is what leaves the deepest mark. Not just the actions themselves, but the space that allowed them to exist. Because in the end, the arrest at the altar wasn't the beginning of the story. It was the moment the story could no longer be hidden. The moment everything surfaced at once.
And long after the headlines fade, long after the case moves on, that moment remains. A reminder that sometimes the most trusted voice in the room is the one hiding the truth the deepest. And when that truth finally comes out, it doesn't just expose a person, it exposes everything around them. In the end, what happened inside that church was more than a scandal. It was a collapse of trust, a collapse of belief, a collapse of the image people held on to for years. Because the man they listened to, the man they believed in, the man they trusted with their most private struggles, was living a truth completely different from the one he preached. And that kind of betrayal doesn't end with an arrest. It stays. It lingers in the questions people continue to ask, in the doubt that replaces certainty, in the silence that follows when everything once trusted is suddenly uncertain. For those who were there, that day never really ends. It repeats in memory. The voice at the altar, the doors opening, the moment everything shifted without warning.
And for those who hear the story now, it leaves something behind: a discomfort, a question, a realization that not everything is as it appears, because some of the most convincing voices are the ones no one thinks to question until it's too late, until the truth forces its way into the open, until there's no space left to hide. And when that moment comes, it doesn't just reveal actions, it reveals the cost of believing without doubt, the cost of silence, the cost of power placed in the wrong hands. Because this story isn't just about one man, it's about what happens when trust is given freely, without question, without limits, and what it becomes when that trust is broken completely. Some will move on, some will try to forget, but moments like this don't disappear. They stay as reminders, quiet but permanent, that truth doesn't always show itself immediately. Sometimes it waits until the exact moment it can longer be ignored. If you want to uncover more chilling true crime stories and see justice exposed, subscribe to Crime Vaults as we bring light to the darkest true crime cases and never miss the secrets hidden in plain sight.